This has been a challenging and unusual spring for high schoolers, to say the least. And now some students are worried they might have to take their advanced placement tests again after having issues submitting their responses online. NBC Stay Tuned host Savannah Sellers joins me now. And Savannah, I may be a long way out of high school, but oh my gosh, I can't even imagine. Those tests were like, this is horrible. For our viewers who maybe never took them or don't know what they are, can you remind them what these advanced placement exams are and what's going on with these students?
Absolutely, Allison. I totally agree with you. Reporting on this was a walk down a very stressful memory lane, that's for sure, thinking about these AP exams. So that stands for Advanced Placement. And this is a program put on by the College Board so that high school students can take college-level curriculum. And then these exams are what all of that semester culminates in. Depending on how well you do on that exam determines if you can get college credit early. So these courses you take in high school count towards college. So of course, these students are super worried about these scores and then being counted and being able to do these exams. So what's happened for some students, and it is just a small minority of them, but for some students, they've had issues with actually submitting their answers. There was no place within these tests to actually do your work in the text fields that were in these exams that students are doing online. Basically, they were having to work in a different document and then copy and paste over or save that document as a PDF or do their work handwritten, take a picture of it, and then upload the photo. There were these sort of hidden instructions that you also had to go into your settings on your phone, change the settings on your camera, go into formats, change it to most compatible. It's just something you would not normally know how to do. And a lot of these students had issues with that copy and paste feature, messing up their format or not being able to upload those photos. I'm going to have you listen to what some students said about their experience. And now keep in mind, these students were working on their AP Calculus exam and their AP Physics C Mechanics, whatever that means, exams, and their answers were not counted. So take a listen to what they had to say.
To have it not go through, and it wasn't my fault, to have, all that work is just basically wiped. It doesn't matter. It's completely gone. It's so upsetting and aggravating because it's like me as a student, I feel so powerless that I can't do anything about it. And that's all my work is basically gone. Knowing that I would have been done today, my grades are basically all in, and now I have to go possibly a whole another month. And I graduate in June. After physics, I guess I would say sad, just because I didn't see it coming, and I kept running scenarios through my head how I could have fixed that. I would say after the second time, it was more angry and frustrated. He literally lost his mind. Like I said before, I'd never seen him like that. So we have a gym downstairs. He went down and started, punching this punching bag, and I'd never seen him do that. And
so, Allison, you hear there, even his dad saying he went down to the basement hitting a punching bag. He's never seen him do that before. He also told me he heard a couple words he'd never heard his son say before, which was just so sad to hear. And just, can you imagine they're doing that work by hand on calculus problems and none of it counts?
Savannah, I took both of those exams. I still remember the calculus and the physics AP exams. I'm old, and I don't know if they've changed them, but I remember they were scored up to 5 back then. I would have gotten a 0 in that situation. I would have been so stressed out. I don't know how they dealt with it. The punching bag, a great idea. Has the College Board responded to these reports or commented on what's going on?
Okay, first of all, we're going to need to talk later about the fact that you took both AP Calculus and Physics. Hello. But also, yes, they have responded. First, by noting that 1.47 exams in the last 3 days have been done online, which is a pretty big feat if you think about this always historically happening in a classroom with teachers they're watching. But the rest of their statement did say, after the first few days of testing, our data shows the vast majority of students successfully completed their exams with less than 1% unable to submit their responses. So again, it was that minority. I will point out, as much is true of this statement these days, that minority did take to Twitter, though, so they were pretty loud about it and all sort of commiserating on social media.
So, Savannah, what can those students do? Because, I mean, I know this is really important. It can help them get more advanced placement in classes and skip classes when they get to college, which can save you a whole bunch of money if you don't have to take certain courses. What's the recourse here?
Absolutely. So the College Board did also address that in their statement, saying that they are working to understand each student's unique circumstances in advance of the June makeup exams. Any student who encountered an issue during their exam will be able to retest. So basically, they just have to take it again. Here's the catch, though, Allison. They actually have to apply to retake it, and they're not going to find out for a couple of weeks if they have qualified to retake it, if the College Board does deem, that their questions and answers didn't seem that they could fit them together enough that they are worth giving another exam to. And then, of course, they just have to stay in the mental game right now as a high schooler who's just about done with school to be ready to potentially take another calc exam a month from when they thought they were going to have to. So it is tough. And really, it's just highlighting the issues that there is with learning and testing and all of this in general from home. I was asking a bunch of students that I was talking to about, have you had issues? How's this gone? And so many students were just pointing out just in general, their issues with connection to the Wi-Fi. And if one sibling gets on a device on the Wi-Fi, all of this becomes difficult. So just imagine the stress level with a test like this.
Oh, I feel so badly for them. I mean, look, we older folks love to tell younger people that high school is the best time of your life. And I feel like they're all shaking their heads thinking, what are you telling us? Savannah, such a rough situation for those guys. I hope it works out. Maybe they'll get an even better score the next time around. Let's look at the positive, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.